I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Anduril's Arsenal 1 and Rebuilding the Arsenal of Democracy. And of course, Arsenal 1 is what the founder of Anduril, Palmer Luckey, calls this huge manufacturing facility they plan on building in Ohio, in the United States. And what he's trying to do is kind of channel this image and style of, say, Elon Musk and what he has done with SpaceX and Tesla in terms of aerospace and electric vehicles. And he's trying to do this in terms of military weapons, equipment, and military vehicles. Now, I'm going to read this article, and as always, I'm going to add additional information when and if necessary, and I'm going to share with you all of the sources that I cited in this article, including an interview Palmer Luckey, the founder of Anduril. And in case you're wondering what Anduril even means, it is the name of a sword in the fictional work Lord of the Rings. Okay? Let me begin. With the conflict in Ukraine exposing how unprepared the United States' military-industrial base is for peer or near-peer conflict, continued efforts are being made to either match Russian and Chinese military-industrial output or otherwise compensate for it. And in this article, I'm going to talk about how the U.S. is attempting to compensate in terms of using what they believe is innovative technology that they hope China cannot replicate, although I would highly recommend against betting on that. However, there are examples of how the US has actually succeeded in doing this, at least in the short term. For example, before SpaceX began ramping up space launches using its reusable Falcon 9 family of rockets, China was actually overtaking the United States in space launches every single year. Now the United States is back on top by a large margin, and it will take China a very long time to catch back up. As a matter of fact, China almost certainly is going to have to design and deploy their own types of reusable rockets to catch up. And they are. It will take time. There is a possibility they will catch up, but at the moment, the United States is on top in terms of annual space launches. And I've done other videos about why that's important and the advantage that gives the United States. Let's admit where advantages do exist, whether you want them to exist or not, they exist, and they favor the United States. Another example of the US compensating for an inability to match Chinese industrial output, including military industrial output, is the use of asymmetrical military power. So I've talked in a previous video about how the US is obviously increasingly unable to fight China head on off of China's own shores. So what the US is going to do is use its still very tremendous military power stretched out all around the globe. It will use that to interdict Chinese maritime shipping beyond the reach of the Chinese military, which is confined to Chinese territory. Despite all the propaganda about the threat China poses to the world, its military is in China, while the US's military is spread all over the globe. And so that gives the United States an advantage. If they interdict maritime shipping, they hope they can strangle the Chinese economy back at home. And that is a way they can defeat China without having to fight them head on. So keep all of this in mind as I read through this article. Palmer Luckey of Anduril envisions creating autonomous weapon systems at hyperscale. I'll get into what that is in just a moment. And using software he thinks China will not be able to replicate and produce en masse. I doubt it, but that's what he thinks. So let's continue. Many attempts to do so, including ongoing efforts by the U.S. Army to expand 155mm artillery shell production, have shown progress, but have fallen far short of matching, let alone exceeding, the output of just Russian shell production alone. We've talked about this in length over the years. And actually, U.S. shell production began expansion before the conflict in Ukraine began. So that was a long-term project. That was not something they did in reaction to the Russian military operation in Ukraine. That was something they were already in the process of doing, which is why that appears to be the most successful program they have. These things take years to do. Also, with artillery shell production, despite attempting to expand it on a large scale, they still have fallen far short of what Russia is able to do. And again, this all comes down to the difference between a profit-driven industry and a purpose-driven industry. There is no way for a profit-driven industry to outcompete a purpose-driven industry, all other factors being equal. So China, whose industrial base overall dwarfs that of the US, Europe, Japan, and South Korea combined, has demonstrated not only an ability to surpass the US in quantity, but now also in quality. We're seeing a lot of news stories about this from the Western media, about how Chinese military equipment isn't just numerous, it is also of very high capability. In some cases, it is able to do things Western military technology cannot. China has already established one of the largest and most capable missile forces on Earth. I've talked about this in previous videos and articles, and the source is CSIS. It's a US government and arms industry funded think tank. They have a whole series titled Missile Threat, CSIS Missile Defense Project. They talk about missiles of the world, and in this case, missiles of China. And they talk about all the different kinds of missiles. The United States not only has fewer missiles overall, except in terms of nuclear missiles, maybe, nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles, but there's also certain varieties of missiles China has that the United States simply doesn't have. And that is because the US signed arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, and then for a short time with the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, prohibiting them from designing, developing, deploying missiles with certain capabilities. China never signed any of these treaties, and so they were able to develop all of these different types of missiles with different capabilities. So they have a huge head start on that, just in terms of research, development, deployment, and experience managing and maintaining them. But they also have this industrial advantage over the US as well. China also possesses one of the largest, most advanced integrated air defense systems, which includes battle-proven Russian-built S-400 air defense systems. In recent years, it has expanded the production of its Chengdu J-20 fifth-generation warplane to match the numbers of the US's fifth-generation F-22 fighter jet, and is on track to match the annual production rate of the US's other fifth-generation warplane, the F-35. Last year, China unveiled its own additional fifth-generation warplane, the J-35, and will likely expand production to match or exceed that of the J-20. So we have, actually, these are older articles that talk about the expanded production of the J-20. This was China's first fifth-generation warplane. This was back in 2022, and they were talking about how rapidly China was expanding production of this advanced warplane and how it was matching or exceeding the numbers of F-22s the US has on hand. And then we remember just at the end of last year, the J-35. So this is another advanced fifth-generation warplane developed by China. They recently unveiled it. It is not in mass production, not to my knowledge, but considering what they've already done with the J-20 and all of their other warplanes, it seems like the inevitable next step. That is something to keep a close eye on. The gap in terms of advanced fighters between the US and China is rapidly closing. And once it's closed, it's going to rapidly tilt in China's favor. And there's very little I can think of that the US can do to reverse this, considering the key factor is just the sheer scale of China's industrial base. What can the United States do without matching or exceeding the size of China's industrial base, including the human resources that serve that industrial base? The US Department of Defense admits that many of the munitions these Chinese warplanes carry are as capable or more capable than those carried by US warplanes, including air-to-air missiles with longer ranges than their US counterparts. So there are articles like this. Again, this was 2023, and this is only improving in China's favor. Department of Defense's new China report details CCPs. There's no such thing as the CCP. It is the Communist Party of China, CPC. Calling it the CCP is as ignorant as calling the USA the ASU. It is utterly ignorant. The US does this on purpose, and the US and Europe have done this for a very long time regarding nations outside of the collective West, telling them what they will be called rather than calling them what they call themselves. It is one of these aspects of Western domination. It's one of these little details that add up to create the sense of superiority the West honestly believes in and allows to drive its foreign policy, spanning decades, if not generations, centuries. New China report details China's growing military arsenal, and they talk about a wide range of weapons, including warplanes and their armament and these air-to-air missiles with longer ranges. In combat, if a warplane can see you before you see it, and it is able to launch a missile that can hit you before your missiles are in range of it, it has the advantage. And that is the implication there. In terms of shipbuilding, I've recently gone over this in a recent video as well, unpacking China's naval buildup, again, from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is based in Washington, D.C., funded by the U.S. government and the Western arms industry. And so they're very obviously pro-U.S., and they're basically making a case for war with China and blueprinting what a war with China would look like. And so this is why they're attempting to keep track of what China is really doing. And if you really want to defeat your enemy, you have to know what they're really doing. They know the general public isn't reading these papers. They're reading whatever the headlines are in their mainstream media of choice, telling them how dangerous China is, how China is going to collapse by the end of the year. But in these think tanks, their papers are more honest because they're trying to figure out how to honestly undermine and overthrow these competitors that they simply don't want to exist. So in terms of shipbuilding, China has surpassed the United States so profoundly, and if you read this paper, they will admit this. So profoundly, U.S. policymakers admit closing the gap is unrealistic and instead seek to compensate through the development of manufacturing of large numbers of smaller vessels and aircraft, including a variety of autonomous systems. So they're saying, we can't possibly build as many destroyers, aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships as China can, but maybe we can make more smaller vessels to compensate for these larger vessels China is making. Maybe we can make all kinds of drones, aircraft, maritime vessels that are autonomous and can swarm these larger ships that China is outproducing us with. But the whole point is, and this is what I say in the article, this is what I actually say, it should seem obvious that if China is capable of matching or exceeding the US in terms of missiles, aircraft, and ship production, possessing the largest, most prolific commercial drone company on Earth, which is DJI, China will be easily able to match or exceed both the quantities and quality of US-made autonomous systems. This seems like common sense. This seems like a no-brainer, and yet US policymakers don't seem to take that into account when they're proposing these solutions. So let's start talking about Anduril and the rebuilding of the arsenal of democracy. And of course, this has nothing to do with democracy. That is just branding. And I think you'll get why here in just a moment. This conclusion that if China can outproduce the US in ships and aircraft and missiles, they'll definitely be able to outproduce the US in terms of things like drones, since they already do outproduce the US in things like advanced drones, DJI, for example. This conclusion appears lost on Palmer Luckey, the founder of Oculus VR, a virtual reality headset manufacturer and now founder of arms manufacturer Anduril. Luckey believes that Anduril will be able to hyperscale production of autonomous aircraft, maritime vessels, and munitions to rebuild the arsenal of democracy and thus lend victory to the US in a future great power conflict with China. Palmer Luckey is utterly obsessed with China. He insists that it is an imminent threat to the United States, that the US must produce the ability to overpower China in a military conflict. Does Palmer Luckey believe China is going to storm the beaches of California or appear out of the sewers of New York City? No, he's talking about defeating China right off of China's shores. And we know this because he's more or less said it I'll get to that in just a moment. Anduril drones have already been used over the battlefield in Ukraine, a peer conflict the US is waging against Russia by proxy. This is already a peer conflict. And we can see how US-made weapons and munitions are faring in a peer conflict, in this case with China. Those drones have failed to grant Ukraine any advantage as its forces face a total collapse of fighting capacity, losing heavily defended territory to advancing Russian forces at an accelerated rate across the entire line of contact. This is something that I point out in all of my updates regarding the conflict in Ukraine. And again, I'm using all Western sources to make this point. Much of Ukraine's failure on the battlefield is owed specifically to the limits of its Western sponsors and their ability to field practical, low-cost, and numerous enough weapons and systems to match those Russia is deploying. So Anduril has sent these drones. I have not heard anything about whether these drones are performing well or not, but obviously, whatever they're doing, it's not enough to change the strategic direction of the conflict in Ukraine's favor. And so, all other factors being equal, Anduril is not going to come in and shift a battle in the favor of the collective West or their proxies. It could be argued that Anduril's technology hasn't been fully matured and the advantage of hyperscaling not yet fully realized, because they plan on doing this hyperscaling in their new Arsenal 1 factory. But a much more likely explanation is a fundamental flaw in Anduril's approach based on an equally flawed understanding of geopolitics and national security, coupled with self-serving, short-sighted priorities, including profit over purpose. So here we go back to profit versus purpose. This is key to understanding. In a January 17th, 2025 interview with Bloomberg Technology, that is this one right here. The link will be in the video description below. I'm going to cover this in the article, but I'm also going to show you clips from this interview, because to truly appreciate what Palmer Luckey is saying, you need to hear it from himself. So in this interview, Luckey described the building of Arsenal 1, Anduril's first hyperscale production facility. Based in Ohio, Luckey claims it will provide up to 4,000 jobs over the course of the next 10 years and produce thousands of Anduril's defense products, including cruise missiles and autonomous warplanes.
The way we look at ourselves is as a defense product company, not a contractor, but a product company, meaning we take a product company approach. We decide what to build it, how to build it, when it's done, and we invest our own money into making that happen. Then we sell products to the customer. Now, we work hand in hand with customers through that process. It's not like I can go off and build a Batmobile and try to sell it to them because I think it's cool.
Except that isn't entirely true, because at least in the case of Fury, Anduril's Fury autonomous warplane, this was actually bought from another company that was already in the process of developing, as this Warzone article explains. And down here, they mentioned that it was originally being developed by Blue Force Technologies. And all along, Blue Force Technologies was developing this aircraft through US government grants. So it is not Anduril's own money. It is the money of American taxpayers that is developing at least this weapon. Luckey sells Arsenal 1 as a vision of not only revolutionizing US-based military manufacturing, but as a means of compensating for China's vast industrial base and growing military might.
We don't have time for business as usual. The types of threats that the United States is facing, that our allies around the world are facing, the fact that we are predicted to run out of munitions within the first 8 days of a potential conflict with China mean that we need to hyperscale our manufacturing.
To fully achieve this vision, however, Luckey insists on the US leveraging the whole of the nation to face and overcome the threat he claims China poses.
I don't think that we actually need radical changes in the system for Anduril to do very well, but for our country to do well, for us to build a national security apparatus, we need to move quickly. We need to take targeted risks. We need to get more companies into defense manufacturing, and that includes companies that are not currently defense companies, getting big tech in, getting little tech in, getting a lot of our industrial providers in. That is how we won World War II, was leveraging the whole of the nation. I think that that's the only way that we're going to win in the future as well.
And it should be pointed out that Palmer Luckey does seem to understand the factors required to create an industrial base.
Ohio's quite busy. Intel has a fab going up.
That's right.
Quite nearby. Do you see that as a sort of competition for talent, or do you see it as value add to being here?
It's both. There's value added, and of course, I'm probably going to hire some of their people, and they're going to hire some of our people. That's just the way that these things always go. What you want to try to do is make the area more attractive in general, right? Like if Anduril was here and we were the only company that was in the area, it'd be harder to get really, really world-class people to want to stay in the area or move to the area because we're the only game in town.
Right.
When they know that it's a healthy ecosystem of career choices, it's a lot easier to get people to come, even if you do manage to keep them around.
Because he's talking about Anduril's facility in Ohio. He's talking about how Intel is also going to open a facility there, how the more industry you bring into an area, the more synergy that is created. And all of this is true. And a lot of these are things that a lot of people talking about reindustrializing the US, they don't really seem to understand. But Palmer Luckey does seem to understand it. The problem is, if you understand that, then you understand the immense advantage China has, considering the vast industrial base it has and all of the interconnected synergy created by it. Places like Shenzhen and all of the high-tech companies and industry located there, the vast state-owned enterprises, their interaction with private enterprise all across China, the different areas that China is developing in terms of developing technology even further, technology and industry further. And then just, again, the sheer scale that it is all on. Surely he understands the vast advantage that lends China, the inability for the US to match that. There's no way they will ever match that scale. It will never happen. Let's talk about what Palmer Luckey and Anduril are planning on making in this hyperscale Arsenal 1 facility.
So the things that we're building, they're driven by what our customers need, but we are investing a lot of our own money in them. So obviously we're building Fury, our autonomous fighter jets. Behind you, you see all three of the different Barracuda cruise missile family. So the Barracuda 100, Barracuda 250, Barracuda 500, autonomous swarming cruise missiles. We're also going to be building a lot of our ISR drones. We're going to be building a lot of our mobile command and control systems here. And we're even going to be building some combat heads-up displays here. I think you're going to be hearing some news about that soon.
Forbes, in its own recent article, this article right here, Anduril goes big in Ohio with Arsenal 1 hyperscale drone plant. They show this. This is a reusable jet-powered interceptor / attack drone. I will talk about that in just a minute. It looks very impressive, but when you really think about it, it makes no sense at all. I'll get into that in just a moment here. The plant is designed, so this is Forbes in its own recent article about the construction of the facility claims, so this is a quote from Forbes, the plant is designed to produce tens of thousands of drones per year. Initially, these are likely to be Anduril's current product range. The Fury, an autonomous jet fighter, which work alongside crewed platforms. The Roadrunner, which I just showed you, a one-way interceptor and attack drone, but it's also reusable. So if it doesn't actually strike a target, it will come back and land and you can reuse it. And Barracuda, a family of long-range attack drones or cruise missiles with ranges of 100 to 500 miles. However, based on publicly available information, neither the Fury nor Barracuda have been built even as prototypes, let alone finished products. When I say prototype, I mean a working example, a example of what this autonomous aircraft or cruise missile can and will do when it's mass produced. A working prototype, not a static display model. Anduril has plenty of those. As a matter of fact, that's what I say next. Instead, Luckey often poses in front of what are most likely one-to-one scale models of the proposed weapon systems, which will face years of further development before they end up mass-produced and sold to the US government or exported abroad. This is just a reality of developing technology. It takes time. You cannot just draw it on a napkin one day and mass produce it the next day. It doesn't work that way, at least not yet. And nothing Palmer Luckey has said about Arsenal 1 or Anduril suggests otherwise. Now, while the Roadrunner has been built and tested and even ordered by the Pentagon to the tune of over 500 units, which sounds like a lot. So again, there will be 500 of these at least going to the Pentagon. It is unlikely this system represents a cost-effective solution amid modern conflicts such as Ukraine, featuring thousands of drones and missiles fired per year. When I say that, I mean just by Russia alone. I don't mean by Ukraine and Russia together. According to Luckey, the Roadrunner's price is in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit, while the Russian-made Garan 2 long-range kamikaze attack drone, for example, is estimated by Western sources to cost approximately $50,000 US per unit. I think that's in the higher range, but I will take the higher range number the West is claiming it costs and use that as a reference point rather than using the cheapest price point they mentioned, just to make this argument hit even harder. So the low hundreds of thousands of dollars for this Roadrunner up against a Garan 2, which costs maybe $50,000 US or perhaps less. The Russian military industrial base produces thousands of Garan 2 drones each year and has produced hundreds of thousands of attack and surveillance drones each year for even cheaper. So we're talking about all other kinds of drones for both attack and for surveillance. Hundreds of thousands of drones. This is what Russia is pumping out every single year. According to Russia, it's like over 1 million or more. This makes Roadrunner even more impractical for modern day combat. So again, this is another case of a over-engineered, overly expensive weapon system made in small quantities going up against huge numbers of cheaper weapons produced by Russia and obviously also by China. What Anduril offers is what is perhaps a cheaper and faster way to manufacture military equipment compared to current US military industrial capabilities, but still far short of meeting the practicality, quantity, and quality of weapons and munitions produced by either Russia or China's state-owned enterprises. And by that I mean Anduril talks about making modular systems, using off-the-shelf components. There's a lot of common sense things they are talking about to make their products cheaper, but it still doesn't even come close to what Russia and China can do with their state-owned enterprises. Because ultimately, Palmer Luckey answers to investors who want what? They want profits. They didn't invest in Anduril because they're patriotic. They invested in Anduril because they want profits. A state-owned enterprise is a state-owned enterprise specifically to avoid that obligation, to allow it to meet its purpose first and foremost without the need to profit as an obstacle to get there. It is that simple. This is because Anduril first and foremost exists to generate profits, whereas Russian and Chinese state-owned enterprises exist first and foremost to fulfill the demands of each nation's respective military services and the national security objectives they uphold. We've even heard about how, sure, Russia can do all of this, they can make all of these shells, but they're doing it at a loss. From Moscow's point of view, they don't care because they need those shells in those quantities. And at that quality, they don't care if they're making profits or not. They're going to invest money in what they need, not invest money to make even more money for private industry. But there is a deeper problem still, regardless of whether or not one takes Luckey's claims at value and believes his company and companies like it across the collective West could produce more weapons at better quantity and quality than Russia and China, is the mobilization of skilled labor, national infrastructure, and industry by the United States justified in achieving Luckey's vision? What you would need to do in the United States to match or exceed Chinese military industrial output is essentially mobilize all of American society to stop what they're doing now, divert resources going into the actual inner workings of the US at home, and redirect all of it in this effort to confront China militarily. Is that justified? Let's explore that. The need to hyperscale production, according to Luckey, is based on the fear the US would run out of arms and ammunition after just 8 days of war with China. And this is what he said, and I will show you the clip.
Like I said earlier, we don't have time for business as usual. Right now, people are predicting that there's going to be a window of opportunity for Xi in China that opens in 2027. That means that you necessarily need to be ready for a potential great power conflict with China in 2027 and for at least a few years after that. So we have to, right? There's no other option. The whole point here, the reason we raised that $1.5 billion round, the reason that we've been accelerating this process, the reason that we're investing in building this factory ahead of the customer actually paying us to do it is because we believe in that timeline, because we have to believe in it. It is critical that we hit it, and I think we will.
The impression many may draw by the sense of urgency Luckey attempts to create is that China poses a direct and imminent threat to the United States, but it doesn't. Luckey concludes that weapons produced in his Ohio Arsenal 1 facility could be flown, and again, this is a direct quote from him, directly to the theater, of course, probably with refueling stops along the way.
The supply chain in Ohio is actually very interesting. So you will have use of 2 runways where we are now, Rickenbacker Airport.
That's right.
But my understanding is that, take, for example, a Fury behind us, in some cases, you'll be able literally to take off from the runway, which is just a few feet from where we're sitting, and deliver that technology direct to customer. Explain.
Direct to customer or directly to the action? I mean, so this is Fury. This is our CCA, Collaborative Combat Aircraft. It's basically an autonomous, loyal wingman fighter jet that can fight alongside F-35s and other fighters that the United States and our allies use. But you're right, the goal here is that we can manufacture these aircraft at scale, thousands of these fighter jets here, and then we can either fly them directly to the customer or in some cases directly to the theater. Of course, probably with refueling stops along the way. But that's what we did during World War II, and that's what we plan on doing again.
Because these weapons he's making in Ohio aren't going to the California coast to fight off invading Chinese. They're going all the way to China's coasts to go fight China in China, because that is what a war between the US and China will ultimately look like. That is what Washington is preparing for. This is what China is actually reacting to. That is because any potential war fought between the US and China will be fought off China's own shores. And across the Asia-Pacific region, where the US has spent decades accumulating tens of thousands of US military forces closer to China than to America's own shores. Imagine if it was the other way around. In other words, any potential conflict fought between the US and China will be provoked by and be a product of US encroachment, not extraterritorial aggression from China itself. So is mobilizing all of the US to go fight China in China, is that justified, considering how you will need to redirect all of America's resources away from actually investing in America and investing it all instead in confronting China? Is it justified? In a clip presented by Bloomberg Television. So here is Bloomberg again.
We have a very strong relationship with Taiwan. I've been there many times. In fact, I'm going there again soon. And I think that that strong relationship is actually one of the reasons that Anduril was recently sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. They announced that that they're going to seize all our Chinese assets and that we're prohibited from entering the country. Joke's on them. We don't have any Chinese assets. But it was in the wake of a recent deal that we did with Taiwan, getting them some systems that I think China, frankly, is really afraid of. They know that our systems are the real deal, and they know they can't jam them. They know they can't hack them. And that's because they're powered by AI.
Luckey brags about his company being sanctioned by the Chinese government for providing military systems to Taiwan, recognized under international law as well as by the US government's own One China policy as Chinese territory. Luckey's violation of Chinese sovereignty and his role in abetting separatism within China's borders is a microcosm of the wider war Luckey is attempting to promote and profit from at Hyperscale. So when I say Washington's One China policy, I'm talking about the official U.S. government's Department of State website and their webpage, U.S. relations with Taiwan. And if you read through all of this, they are telling you explicitly, we do not support Taiwan independence. So if Taiwan is not independent, that means it is dependent on someone or something else, what is it dependent on? What does international law recognize Taiwan as an island province of China? The One China policy, which the United States even mentions on their own official State Department website, One China policy, recognizes that there is only one China. Taiwan is part of China, and there's only one legitimate government of China, and that is the People's Republic of China in Beijing, not the Republic of China in Taipei, Taiwan. So this is the double game that the U.S. is playing, and this is a double game that Palmer Luckey and Anduril is participating in, promoting, and of course, profiting from. And I'll get into his profits here in just a moment. One final point of interest was revealed during Luckey's interview with Bloomberg Technology. So this was the first interview that I've showed you clips from so far. When asked whether or not Luckey would be spending more time in Ohio as a result of the facility's construction, this is how he responded.
And I know you'll be spending a lot of time here as well.
Well, I'm definitely going to be buying a house out here. I'm blessed with financial success from my first company, Oculus VR, that allows me to get a place so I don't have to get a hotel room when I'm spending time out here.
This guy is so rich that whenever he travels someplace, if he feels like he's going to have to travel there more than one time maybe, he'll just buy a house there because that's how rich he is. Now, he's claiming that this is because of his success at Oculus VR. They made VR, virtual reality headsets that you would use while playing a video game or watching virtual reality media. You may be familiar with the Oculus Rift, but he is making millions of dollars off of Anduril as well. And he doesn't want to talk about that because then it would just make him sound and look like a war profiteer, which is basically what he is. So let's talk about that. Of course, Palmer Luckey's role at Anduril also contributes millions of dollars annually to his personal financial success, allowing him to simply buy houses anywhere he goes rather than stay at hotels. So according to TechCrunch, this right here, hardly a media publication critical of the collective West, from 19 million to 1.5 million, here's how much Anduril pays top execs like Palmer Luckey in cash and stock. So let's just go scroll down to Palmer Luckey. That looks like almost 11 million to me. This was year 2021. Palmer Luckey sold his virtual reality company, Oculus VR, to Facebook in 2014 for around $2 billion. He left the company on bitter terms 3 years later and went out to co-found Anduril. And he's not doing it out of charity. He's doing it because he makes millions of dollars a year at Anduril. Anduril itself is making hundreds of millions of dollars, if not $1 billion or more every year. He even talks about that in the interview with Bloomberg.
We're doing really well. We're winning a lot of contracts. We're making quite a bit of money.
We doubled last year to about $1 billion.
That's the rumor. That's the rumor. Things are doing really, really well. So we don't have to IPO to raise money to keep the company going.
In other words, Palmer Luckey is selling war with China rhetorically and politically to sell weapons and profit financially. Very simple. Not a mystery or an enigma difficult to figure out. The more fear and urgency he can generate, the more weapons he can sell, regardless of their practicality or performance. And the more his company and he himself personally profits. Whether Luckey really believes China is a threat or that Anduril is the answer to that threat is irrelevant. The true nature of Anduril and people like Palmer Luckey leading it prevents it and the rest of the collective West's for-profit military-industrial base from matching, let alone exceeding, Russian or Chinese military-industrial output. This truth, demonstrated amid the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, reflects the true profit-driven motivations of Anduril and Luckey, whether Anduril and Luckey understands it or wants to admit it or not. Now, of course, if winning a conflict comes down to the size of each nation's military-industrial output, then yes, Russia and China will inevitably win. But as I have warned, there are many other factors the U.S. can play to succeed where their military-industrial output cannot alone. For Americans convinced by Luckey's rhetoric that China truly is an urgent threat to them and their way of life, it is actually Palmer Luckey, Anduril, and other companies and individuals like them demanding America leverage the whole of the nation by diverting resources needed to thrive at home toward efforts to antagonize and coerce other nations abroad. Again, remember, this entire conflict building up with China is over the United States and Palmer Luckey himself violating Chinese territory by ignoring the America's own one China policy, recognizing Taiwan as part of China, violating it by selling weapons to the administration there and encouraging armed separatism from the rest of China. And if it was the other way around, it would have been war already. This results in transferring the wealth of the American people toward Palmer Luckey's overpriced weapons and ultimately toward his next new home, rather than toward better education, affordable health care, better infrastructure for the average American man, woman, or child. In the end, Palmer Luckey and Anduril pose a much greater threat in reality to the average American and their way of life than any threat China is claimed to pose in fiction. And that is the end of the article. And of course, the threat of the military-industrial complex is a threat that has been warned against for decades. President Dwight Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned about the military-industrial complex.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
These are people who put profit over purpose. They also put profit over the self-preservation of America as a functioning nation state rather than a host for these parasites to feed off of, is also a threat to the way of life of average Americans. Their tax dollars should be being invested in America. That is the whole promise of Make America Great Again, America first. Instead of spending money on wars and interference abroad, we should be spending it here in America to make America better. And instead, it is not, because we have people lying to us about threats that do not actually exist overseas. The threat is actually stemming from the US government itself, people like Palmer Luckey himself going overseas and provoking conflict with those nations, not the other way around. Then they demand American taxpayer dollars go into their coffers to build weapons to be pointed abroad rather than that money being spent back at home to actually make America a livable, functioning nation state for the actual American people living there. So this is a huge problem, and until people understand this problem, until they can ignore all the left-right political rhetoric that divides and distracts them and see people like this are the problem. These are the people who are the problem. People like him, not just the arms industry, big tech, big pharma, the auto industry, the aerospace monopolies, all of these deeply entrenched corporate financier and industrial monopolies, they are the problem. They are the ones driving U.S. foreign policy, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress. These interests are the ones funding think tanks like CSIS, Brookings Institution, the Rand Corporation. They create policy papers to arrive at consensus among them, because there are many people like Palmer Luckey, and they need to arrive at consensus in terms of foreign policy. And then those papers are taken by lobbyists to Washington to be signed off on as bills, as actual US policy, and then it goes to the corporate media to sell this agenda, these narratives to the American people themselves. See through it and see who these people actually are driving your foreign policy, and see who it is taking your money and diverting it from being used at home to make your life better, and instead being used overseas to provoke war. That also is certainly not going to benefit you or your family, actually endanger you and your family, but also to be spent on buying people like Palmer Luckey yet another house. How many of us are lucky enough to own even one very modest house, let alone houses anywhere you feel you might need to travel often? So I hope this article is useful to you. If you thought it was helpful in any way, please like and share this video. The link to the article will be in the video description below. Feel free to share that link as well. In the video description below are all of the other links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can find and follow my work on other platforms. I post all of my videos on YouTube, on Telegram, on X, and also on Rumble. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no additional resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.